Welcome to week 6, the finale, the grand finale. Well, if it gets, we might do at some point because there's a back-to-school night going on here tonight. After we give people time to come in late, because I know the parking lot's really crowded, I might end up closing that door because I know they're having a presentation down in the sanctuary right now, and once that's done, they're going to get to wander the school and visit the classrooms and everything. So I'm betting we're going to have a whole big crowd of people walking right past that door. We're not going to want that open. So, all right. So what I wanted to do to get things started tonight is I wanted to kind of revisit where we're at. The class, like I said, is based on the case for Christ, somewhat on the case for a creator, works from Lee Strobel. And so we've kind of been following Mr. Strobel's pattern and the way that he went through his books. But there are some things that I think are really important to discuss that he didn't really discuss in either of those books, and that's kind of what tonight is for. So we're kind of backtracking a little bit. Now, the 12-step approach to demonstrating Christianity, like I told you, this is a classical apologetic approach. This actually, I don't think I mentioned it in the earlier class, but this is actually from Norman Geisler. Give him credit. This is not my approach. Norman Geisler came up with this, and it's in his book, the Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, I think is what it's called. Now, we didn't hit every single one of these because, well, we don't have time to hit every single one of these. But remember, I told you a couple weeks ago that we do have a new program starting up on September 14th, I think that's the Friday, on the Trinity Drop YouTube channel. It's called Pocket-Sized Apologetics, and that's where we're going to have, each week is going to have a new video, and they're like 2 minutes or less. They're really short, really concise. Just one little isolated apologetic thought, and that's all you need to absorb for that particular week. That is at least initially going to follow this pattern. So the gaps that we didn't hit in this class, we're going to pick up in that program. But the first one is truth is knowable, opposites can be true, or opposites cannot be true. Sorry, big difference. We didn't really touch on those too much in this class. We kind of started with step 3 here. The theistic God exists. Miracles are possible. In connection with the truth claim, God verifies that claim through the use of miracles. We talked about if you want to know messages from God, lots of times he will confirm it with the miracles, so you know this is really from him. The New Testament documents are reliable. From a historical perspective, we can get reliable information from them. In those New Testament documents, Jesus claims to be God. His claims to be God were confirmed by a unique set of miracles. We talked about both the miracles he performed, and of course, last week, the ultimate miracle that confirms who he says he was the resurrection itself. And then we start to see what we can conclude from this. Well, if all that is true, therefore, Jesus was God. In number 10, whatever he said, because he was God, that means whatever he said was true, must have been true. You can see how these kind of build on each other. He said the Bible is the Word of God. Therefore, the Bible is the Word of God, and anything that contradicts it is false. All right. So you can see how you start from the very beginning. Each step by step takes you all the way up to the truths of Christianity. Sarah, can I ask you to do me a favor? It's already begun. Can you kind of shut that door? Hopefully, this should be unlocked. People should still be able to get in it, but it's already getting kind of loud out there. So the reason I wanted to revisit this 12-step approach is kind of to show you where we are this week. We kind of worked our way through a lot of those steps, but this week we're kind of going back to number 3, which is where we spent the first 2 weeks of the class talking about the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the design argument, things like that. But we're going to talk a little bit what's called the moral argument tonight, which is how you demonstrate the existence of God because of the existence of what's called objective morality. That is, and we're doing that not just to give you another argument for the existence of God, but also to demonstrate how that ties into one of the leading objections that's raised against the Christian faith, namely the existence of suffering and evil. People will ask, if there's so much suffering in the world, how can a good God exist? Well, the answer to that, in part, depends upon the moral argument for the existence of God, as we'll see as we get through the class. Now, we are going to follow the same basic pattern that we've been following, even though this isn't from the Case for Christ documentary anymore. I do still have some videos that I've kind of put together to show you. We've got 2 tonight that we'll kind of intersperse as we go through here. But before we start the first one, I want to give you a little bit of foundation to understand what I mean by objective morality. All right, and the gentleman on the screen is Greg Koukl. We were talking before this class started about him. He wrote a great book called Tactics that I recommend. But this is another one of his examples. He's another Christian apologist. And he explains the difference between objective and subjective morality, kind of like the difference between insulin and ice cream. All right, I want you to take two different statements. All right, the first statement is mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream. All right, I don't care if you disagree with it. That's objectively true. No, I'm kidding. That's of course obviously me, but we'll get to what that means in a minute. Compare that first statement. All right, mint chocolate chip is the best flavor of ice cream. Statement number two. Insulin is a necessary medication to treat many diabetics. Now you can look at these two statements and you can say both of them are making what we call truth claims, all right? They have truth value. They're both claiming something to be true. But what exactly are they claiming to be true? In the first instance, mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream. It's not really making a statement about the ice cream as much as it's making a statement about me, the person making the statement. What that is saying is I personally prefer mint chocolate chip ice cream over all other flavors. I am what's called the subject of that sentence, all right, the one making the sentence, whereas the object of the sentence is what it's referring to. In this case, the ice cream would be the object. I, the person making the statement, would be the subject. We call that a subjective truth because it's something that's true for me, mint chocolate chip tasting better than any other ice cream, but other people might not necessarily agree with that. Sarah, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? Chocolate chip cookie dough. My daughter loves chocolate chip cookie dough, so she's not going to agree with that statement. So it's a subjective statement. It's still true in the sense as long as we understand what it's actually claiming. It's claiming a preference that I have, and it is still true that that is my favorite flavor of ice cream. But it's a subjective truth. All right. The other statement, insulin is a necessary medication to treat many diabetics. Now that is an objectively true statement. In other words, when we're talking about evaluating whether that statement is true or not, we're looking at the object of the sentence, the insulin. It makes no difference whatsoever whether I personally prefer insulin or not. All right? I can hate insulin. It's still a necessary medication to treat many diabetics. It's still going to do its job whether I prefer it or not. All right? So understanding the difference between those two, between subjective truths and objective truths, the question that we are exploring in this class is whether moral truths, things like murder is wrong, rape is wrong, statements like those, are those objectively true, in other words, true for everybody, whether you personally believe so or not, or are they only subjectively true, all right? If that, it's as a matter of personal preference, so to speak. I just feel it's a good thing to understand. Now, what we got in this first video, this is a compilation of different videos from William Lane Craig. We talked a little bit about him last week. I think he was also featured in the first class. Well, I take that back. It's not all William Lane Craig. There is one other Christian apologist that starts out this video before we launch into William Lane Craig. And this is the one time, for those of you that are watching these videos on YouTube, I always say that we can't show the video portion on YouTube because we don't have the rights to the videos. And for the most part, that's true tonight too, except for the very first part of this video. The very first part of this video, for reasons that will become obvious once you see it, we do have the rights to the first part of this video. So this one will actually show on the YouTube channel, but then once we get past that first segment, then it won't, because I don't have the rights to William Lane Craig stuff. I can show it to you. I can't put it out there on our own channel. But what we've got here with Dr. Craig is, first of all, just a video that he made on his website to kind of explain this, the whole moral argument for God. And it does kind of hint on that objective versus subjective distinction. That's why I wanted to explain that going in. And then also we have some excerpts from a debate that he had with an atheist by the name of Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens has now regrettably passed away. Ironically, his brother is a Christian, and I just got to watch a very interesting video about his own personal testimony. But it's a debate with him and Christopher Hitchens. And what I want you to pay close attention to, and we will talk about it afterwards, is I want you to listen to Mr. Hitchens' response to Dr. Craig. And Dr. Craig will respond to it as well. You'll hear some back and forth. It's going to seem a little choppy because it was like a 2-hour debate, and I've just kind of picked out just those portions that dealt with the moral argument. But ask yourself if what Mr. Hitchens is responding to is really the argument that Dr. Craig made. All right? Because this is a tactic you see used all the time, where people will respond to something as if this is what you said, but you think about it, what they're responding to isn't really what you said at all. Or it's a red herring, or it's what's called a straw man argument. It's very easy to tear down an argument that your opponent didn't really make in the first place. It's a lot harder to actually address what they actually said. So listen very carefully to how Mr. Hitchens responds to Dr. Craig in this. All right, so we will go ahead and we will start this first video. Some people, when they see tragic events like this, actually draw closer to God. Others, however, run from him. They respond by saying that with so much evil in the world, they can't believe in the existence of a loving God. So they deny that he exists. But here's the thing. They aren't just running from God. In running away from him, they're also running toward something else. What are they running toward? They're running toward atheism. But they usually fail to ask themselves if atheism actually gives them the answers that they're looking for. In reality, it puts them in an even bigger dilemma. You see, their starting premise is there's all these evil things going on in the world. But what they fail to appreciate is that it's only because of God that we can even say things are good or evil to begin with. So let's say, here we go. See, cute cartoons, right? So if two people disagree about whether something is legally right, then they can open up the civil law book and find the answer, right? But what if people disagree about whether something is morally right? One person says something is evil, another says it's good. Is there a moral law book that determines what is actually right and actually wrong? See, if atheism is true and there is no God, then human beings are the highest authority on earth. There's no standard above them to help settle these disputes. If one person says murder's good, another says it's evil, on what basis, if there is no God, can we ever say that one of them is correct? There's no standard of true goodness to appeal to. In order for good and evil to be anything more than personal opinion, there has to be a source that transcends human opinion to decide what is actually evil and what is actually good. In other words, we need God. So when people run away from God because of evil, ironically, in even calling something evil in the first place, they have to assume that God exists. So they try to run, but their efforts end up leading right back to him. The first question is, how many people are up to date on their tithing? No, I'm kidding. See, that's going to be our inside joke that people that are watching the video later won't know what that's all about. So you should come to class. No. Anyway, I do want to take a moment to address a couple of things really quickly that Christopher Hitchens said that maybe William Lane Craig didn't quite have a chance to touch at. First thing I want to say, and if you watch the end of that video towards the end, and like I said, these are excerpts from like a 2-hour-long debate, which covered a lot of topics, but Dr. Craig's voice also started to go out by the end there, if you notice, so I think it's just an apologist thing, and so I don't feel so bad that my voice goes out by the end of every class. Anyway, we're going to get into the details of the moral argument here more as we go through the class and kind of break down in more simple terms, hopefully, everything that went on that kind of was thrown at you there. But there are two things that Mr. Hitchens said that I want to address that aren't otherwise part of the curriculum here, and that's slavery and the Golden Rule. All right, this is a real quick explanation, but these are things you see all the time. Say, well, the Bible condones slavery. Well, that's a hot topic because of what that term, the connotation that term has for us here in America nowadays. But it's also just historically inaccurate. The term slavery, as it applied 2,000 years ago in biblical times, was a very different institution from what we had here in America around the time of the Civil War. Now, that's not to say, and the Bible at no point condones treating people differently because of their race. Matter of fact, quite the contrary. If you've got Paul talking in the book of Philemon, talking about, hey, this man who was your slave is equal to you in Christ. There's no man, woman, whatever. We have all these verses that establish equality. Just a real quick overview, we don't have time to go into detail, but slavery as it existed 2,000 years ago, really a more proper, I think, modern term for it would be like some kind of a form of indentured servitude. It was actually a system that was in place in that culture at that time that really wouldn't translate to today's culture anyway, but it was a way of actually providing for the poor. What happened is if somebody a family was so poor they couldn't provide for themselves, they got themselves in so much debt they couldn't provide provide for themselves, that they would be working for their debtor for a certain period of time. Now, first of all, it was a limited period of time. It was a maximum of 7 years, and after 7 years, they were obligated to be freed. All right, so it was not an owner. Nobody owned individuals. People weren't property like they were considered here in America. Furthermore, there were obligations that were placed on the quote-unquote owner or the debtor that they were working for, where they had to care for that person's family. And so now you had a family that could not take care of themselves, that there was a mechanism set up in their culture to make sure they were taken care of, till they got back on their feet, and then they were free to go their own way after a certain period of time. So when people try to make that comparison between, when you see the word slavery in the Bible, understand that is not the same thing as what we had here in America, okay? Not even close to it. That's a real quick overview, but that's all we have time for. The other thing is, anybody notice what Mr. Hitchens did with the Golden Rule? What did he say the Golden Rule was? Anybody remember?
To not do to others.
Do not do to others what you would not want them to do to you. Is that what Jesus said? No. What did Jesus say? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's a seed of truth in what Mr. Hitchens said, all right? The general principle, the way he expressed it, has been around for a long time. All right, do not do to others. But it's always expressed in negative terms. The aspect that Jesus brought to that was to flip it on its head, so to speak, and say, this isn't a negative rule. This is an affirmative rule. This is a positive rule. I'm telling you to go out and do something, not just to sit back and not do something. All right, brings a whole different meaning. If you see, Jesus put an affirmative duty on us to care for the poor and the needy and clothe those who need clothing and things like that. Because if we were in that situation, we would want somebody to provide those needs for us. That's not the way the rule was expressed otherwise. And again, I think we don't have time to go into detail, but if you look at it, at what Mr. Hitchens actually said and his objections to that rule, they only apply to it in its negative form, not in the positive form that Jesus said to it. So while it's true that there was something similar to the Golden Rule that's existed for a long time, Jesus certainly did bring a unique contribution to it, the way he expressed it. All right. So, stop it. Okay, there we go. So what is the moral argument for God? To spell it out in simple premises and a conclusion, all right? Premise one, in order for objective moral values and duties to exist, God must exist. All right. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Don't worry so much if you don't understand what all that stuff, objective moral values and duties, we're going to go over that. But just look at the structure of the argument right now. Can you see where if premises 1 and 2 are both true, the conclusion has to be true. So if someone wants to challenge this argument and challenge God's existence, they have to challenge the truth of either premise 1 or premise 2. All right. So I want to look at those for a minute. And I want to talk about, first of all, moral values and moral duties. This is a distinction that gets lost a lot of the time, and people who are looking at this type of thing fail to recognize there's a fundamental difference between the two. Both have to be explained. Let me ask you a question, because this is the way of waking people up, to get interaction, right? Get people interactive. What is someone, if you were to define someone's character, what does that mean when we say that, so-and-so's character? Who they are, their nature. What are some character traits, some good character traits that you would describe somebody if you thought they had a good character? Generosity. Honesty. Anything else? Caring. Yes, these are all character traits that we would describe. When I used to teach this, when I first started teaching this, I started out by asking people, describe those of you that know me, describe my character traits. Yeah, I don't do that anymore. So, it's one of those things that maybe I don't want to hear the answer. So anyway, but those are character traits. Because when you're talking about a person, we all have a character, and we can describe certain character traits. Well, just like you have a character, so does God. So the difference is God's character is perfect. All right. So when we're talking about moral values, what moral values are essentially character traits of God. So just like you have a character trait that we might call caring, well, so does God. There's something called love. All right, and that is a character trait that God has in his character, loving. All right, but love, as we apply it to God, unlike us, is perfect. All right, none of us meet that standard. We all have times when we probably should do the loving thing and we don't. All right, that is not true of God. God's love or character trait is a perfect character trait without blemish. And so what it is that provides the standard. When you say something, whether you realize it or not, when you say something is loving, when you look at someone else and describe their character and say it's loving, what you're saying is it resembles that character trait of God. All right? So that's what we mean when we say God's character provides the foundation for these moral values. Any good moral value is actually a descriptor of a character trait that lies in God's character. All right? Now, I got a couple examples on the screen here. The one on the right is those color boards at Home Depot, you know, when you want to get the paint samples and figure it out. My kids love these things. Every time we go to Home Depot, we got to get some of the cards. But what they are is if you always pick up one of those cards, and there's like a card that's like pink, right? And each has like 4 or 5 different colors on it. And each one maybe gets a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. They vary. The other picture I've got on there is actually a screenshot I took from my editing software, video editing software, Final Cut Pro, that I use. And it's if I want to adjust the color of a clip or a font, actually is what this from, and you'll see it has a sliding scale where if I select it all the way to the left, my font color, the color of my text is going to be bright white. And as I move along to the right, it becomes darker and darker and darker until I get to an all black text. All right, and I can select anywhere in that range that I want the color of the text to be. Now, if you were to picture, using that example, picture God's unblemished character. When we're talking about God being good, all right, that means that his character trait of goodness is all the way to the left. All right, it's the bright white on that scale. When we talk about someone, a human person, doing a good thing, they've done a good deed, that means it's somewhere along that spectrum, but it's closer to the left side, to the bright white side, than it is to the right side. So, and the further you move along closer to that left side, the more good something becomes, all right? So that's what we mean when we say something is good. We're saying it resembles that character trait in God. None of us meet it perfectly, but we're somewhere along that scale, and we're certainly on the white side of the scale, not the black side of the scale in this example, all right? Now, Plato, everybody heard of Plato? Not Play-Doh, not the clay stuff you play with. Plato, the philosopher, all right? He kind of recognized this, that it wasn't strictly limited to morality, but he recognized that there's these objective moral rules out there. And he kind of proposed that they just exist in the abstract, that this idea of goodness is just out there. It was part of his theory, what we call now, it's the Platonic forms, okay? It exists kind of abstractly out in the universe, this concept of goodness. The problem is, number one, that's kind of a cop-out. I mean, I've shown you where you can, through a character trait, we certainly can see where character traits are described in this way. And if there is God with a character, that does provide us that foundation. But the problem is it's also got more issues with it as far as existing in the abstract. And that's that morality is not simply limited to values. It also includes duties. Just because there is something that exists in the world called goodness, why does that mean you have to be good? There can be something out there that exists that doesn't necessarily impose a duty upon you to actually undergo that, and to actually do that. So when we're explaining morality, we have to explain both the existence or the foundation for the value itself, what is goodness, what does it even mean when we're talking about something being good, being loving, but then why are we under any obligation to do it? And let me ask you this. Do I have a next? I don't want to spoil something. Yeah, here we go. Do you owe a moral duty to a rock?
No.
No. If you leave this building tonight and there's a pebble on the sidewalk and you kick it into the flower bed, have you done anything morally wrong?
No.
No. If you leave here tonight and you're passing me on the sidewalk and you kick me into the flower bed, have you done something morally wrong?
Yes.
All right, we all agree on that. Good. Yes, you have. What's the difference?
You're a person.
I'm a person. Exactly. You owe moral duties to people, not objects. All right? It's the same thing. You also... Animals. One of the videos briefly talked about this. If a cat kills a mouse, we don't say the cat violated some moral duty it owed to the mouse. It's just a cat being a cat. All right? Moral duties are something that arise with people. All right? So, if we're going to say that there are both objective moral values and also objective moral duties, then those duties have to be owed to a person. So you can see how this all kind of fits together. If God's perfect character is the source of morality, and God is a person, then that explains both moral values and moral duties. You can have moral duties because they're owed to God, and he's a person. If you don't have a person above us, so to speak, where all the source of morality lies, then you can't have moral duties or moral values, either one. Morality as a whole concept kind of collapses. Now, this does not mean that other philosophers have not tried to come up with explanations for how morality could exist, all right, without God. But the important thing when you're evaluating these other arguments to remember is it has to be objective. Remember, we talked about objective versus subjective. Those of you that came in late, you'll have to watch the video. It was a really good example about insulin and ice cream. But subjective morality would be something that it's your personal preference. Objective morality is something that applies to everybody, whether we believe it or not. All right, we'll get more into that in a minute. But when you're evaluating these other proposed theories, you have to ask yourself, do they really make morality objective? And most of the time, well, all the time, the answer is no, they don't. The leading candidate, and I'm kind of wrapping a whole bunch of different ones together in this, but evolutionary theories. You heard a little bit about this in the video. A lot of people propose different types of theories of morality that basically says it evolved. Survival of the fittest, all right? That moral rules are constructs of a culture that just benefit the survival of that culture, that just evolved over time. Well, the problem is that really objective morality? Let's assume for the sake of argument that morality could have evolved within a culture. There is a distinction between two things, something called ontology and epistemology. Those are the big fancy terms. Here's what they actually mean. Epistemology is how we come to know something. So let's say that I, in fact, know that the sun is a big giant ball of gas. Ontologically, that is correct. That is true. The true answer is the sun is a big giant ball of gas, right? But let's say that I came to that belief because I believed a bunch of fireflies had too much soda and went up and we won't finish that. You get the analogy, okay? Or they ate too many beans or whatever, and that's how it all came about. I've come at the right conclusion, but through the wrong means, all right? Epistemology is how I arrived at my knowledge, all right? Ontology is what the actual fact is. Evolutionary ethical theories explain epistemology. They explain how societies arrive at certain moral rules, but they don't explain whether the conclusions they came to are actually correct. All right? They don't explain to say if that's all there is. Ultimately, they're still subjective theories. Anytime you just explain how you arrive at a belief, you're still talking about what's going on in someone's mind, not what is true, whether their mind agrees with it or not. All right? It is entirely possible that you could have a moral rule that promotes the survival of a culture that isn't true, but it promotes survival. And the flip side is also true. But let me give you an example from the Bible. Canaanite societies used to feel it was morally justifiable to incinerate innocent babies in order to satisfy their gods. Our society finds that practice to be abhorrent. Do you, especially those of you with children, have a preference between the two? Okay, I'm a little bit discouraged by the fact that you all were much more quick to respond to whether it was right to push me into the garden than you are about whether it's right to incinerate innocent babies. Let me say for the record that if it will save a baby from being incinerated, you are welcome to push me into the garden, okay? Yeah, of course, we can see that we can recognize there's a difference between those two, but they're both moral rules that have evolved, that were accepted by those cultures at that time. So are we really prepared to look at those two rules and say there's no difference between them? If you accept evolutionary ethical theory, you have to. You have to say, hey, they both evolved. That's both what was promoting the survival of their particular culture, so they're both the same. They both stand on equal footing. But that doesn't quite seem right. The reverse, like I said, is also true. Can you think of any moral rules that don't follow this pattern of survival of the fittest. In other words, are there any rules that we tend to think are absolutely true nowadays that are not really promoting the survival of what's best for the society at large? And let me make a proposal for you. What about, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Sorry, no.
I can think of some that you were asking about some things we do that aren't for survival of the fittest.
Yeah, that we still would find that there are moral rules that we have that don't necessarily promote the survival of the fittest in a society.
I mean, I can think of some like where we sort of take care of those babies that may have autism or some sort of genetic disorder that's not sort of a fittest creature, but that we still care and take care of them.
Yeah, anytime we have rules in place that provide for the care of those that are among us that are not the fittest, all right, whether it be, the developmentally disabled or, severely injured or whatever it may be, we would not justify killing them. We want to help them. We want to help them survive, but that is not helping to promote the survival of our society. If those who are developmentally have some kind of developmental disability, propagate and have offspring, well, that's perpetuating the disability throughout the society. That's not, from an evolutionary standpoint, promoting the survival of the fittest in the society. And yet, I think we hopefully will also agree that you can't murder people just because they have some type of developmental disability. All right? So if all that are, this is just more evidence that maybe this isn't really where all morality comes from. Because if we really wanted to explain even what we come to believe to be moral, as being based solely in evolution, then we wouldn't expect to have seen moral rules like this to have resulted. And yet we do. And so that tends to indicate to us that there's something more about our moral sense than just what's best for survival of the fittest. All right, there's something more there. So the other alternative is it possible that objective morality just doesn't exist at all? That there is no such thing as objective morality, that morality is all subjective. It's just whatever we personally believe. You may have one moral code, you may have another moral code, both of you believe what you believe, but there's really no transcendent standard above us to decide who's right and who's wrong. I don't know how well you could see the slides in the video from that first, admittedly not as eloquent apologist as some of the other ones we've seen in these videos here, but that was from a sermon I gave last fall, summer, something like that, I can't remember. It does touch on the problem of evil, which we'll get to in a minute, but it also, I put it in there at this point to kind of help you understand objective morality and what it means. And what we had there is we had two people who were disagreeing. First of all, they were disagreeing about whether something was legally right. In that example, I had two people disagreeing about whether stealing was legally right or not. And one said stealing is right, the other one said stealing is legally wrong, and they couldn't decide they couldn't agree what the answer was. Well, fortunately, we have a law book, a civil law book. We open up the law book, and we can look and see, is stealing legally permitted or not? And the answer is no, it's not. So even if one person thought it was legally correct, they're just wrong, regardless of what their personal opinion is. All right? And the question then becomes, what about morally? If you have those same two people now disagreeing about whether stealing is morally right or morally wrong, and I know this is a later slide, I'm getting ahead of myself, but just sometimes the flow just starts going. If you have two people disagreeing between what's morally right and morally wrong, is there a moral law book, so to speak, above them that would decide between the two? If there is not, then that's what it means to say morality is subjective. It's just whatever exists in your mind is one thing, whatever exists in someone else's mind is another thing, but there's no law book above us to decide which one of us is actually right and which one is actually wrong. Now, the problem with this concept of all morality being subjective, nobody believes it to be true. Oh, don't get me wrong. Some people say they believe it to be true. I can't remember which philosopher said this or which professor said this, but please understand it was said tongue-in-cheek. The first time somebody comes up to you and says that they believe all morality to be subjective, steal their wallet and then see what they say. All right? All of a sudden, they're going to change their tune. We don't really steal anything, okay? This is why I covered the other example. Stealing is wrong, okay? But seriously, when we think about it, when something happens to us, we immediately just go to statement that what you did to me was actually wrong. We don't just brush it off and say, well, obviously, I think that when you punched me in the face, that was the wrong thing to do. You obviously think it was okay, so we'll just go our separate ways, and, there's no way to decide between us, so go ahead, you go about your way, I'll just put ice on it, or, deal with this deformed nose that I've got for the rest of my life. Trust me, I'm a lawyer, and so one thing that I see people do in my office every single time I'm in there is want to sue people because they think they did something wrong to them, all right? And they don't just think it's legally wrong. I got news for you. When people first come to me, they don't know whether there's a legal case or not. That's why they're coming to me. But the reason they're coming to me is because they certainly think something was done wrong to them morally, all right? And they think that those people should be held accountable. As a matter of fact, I got to tell you, one of the biggest problems you have sometimes as a lawyer is to try to get people to think past that. As a lawyer, unfortunately, I got to tell people, well, here's what the law says you get, all right? I'm not necessarily agreeing with it. I think maybe you should be entitled to even more than that, but this is what the law says you get. So as a lawyer, that's all I can get for you within the legal system. And for a lot of people, they're so caught up in the moral dimension of it that they think, well, that's not enough because this person deserves to have more done to them, or I deserve to get more out of it. And that just shows you that ultimately what everybody is envisioning is an objective source of morality that says no matter what everybody thinks, what that person did to me was actually wrong. Everybody assumes there is a transcendent standard. Another interesting thing that Mr. Hitchings mentioned that I don't think he quite realized the implications of is he said that, if you look across cultures, there are certain rules that have been universally believed to be true, regardless of the culture. Like every culture does have rules against murder, for example. Now, they may define murder differently, all right? But certain things that we might consider to be murder, another culture might not. But they all have this concept of murder, and that it's wrong, that it's being wrong. And he tries to say that this shows that all cultures all moralities evolved. Well, that's not necessarily true. Because why should we necessarily, again, evolution is just what supports survival of the fittest. We've already given one example. Why should we expect, if that's the source of morality, for there to be a moral rule against murdering those who are not the fittest in a society? We shouldn't expect that to be the case. And yet those rules do exist. It's more indicative, actually, that there's some kind of moral law that's written on the hearts of everyone. That we all can tap into in some way, shape, or form, which might sound familiar. And I think we're going to get to that in a future slide here in a minute, so I won't spoil too much about it. So the conclusion from what we've seen from the moral argument, what have we seen from the evidence? We see that in God, we can explain both objective moral values and objective moral duties. We also see, this somewhat, you kind of have to take my word for it because we don't have time to go through all the proposed arguments, and I have kind of lumped them in a broad category, but generally speaking, we see that nothing else, no other alternative theories, are able to do that. They don't ultimately result in an objective standard. They always result in just subjective morality. We also see that when the chips are down, everybody assumes that morality is objective. You don't believe, if they don't think so, steal their wallet, see what they say, all right? They all believe there is a standard that applies. What was the argument? Premise one, in order for objective moral values and duties to exist, God must exist. We examined that through the different, both through the Christian theism, that it does explain these things, and the alternative explanations do not. It seems to be the only satisfactory answer. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. We showed that by stealing someone's wallet. No, we did not actually steal someone's wallet. Stop thinking, no, stop it. Give it back to her now. No, I'm kidding. Therefore, God exists, right? That's the basis for the moral argument. Now, something that was touched on in one of the videos that I want to touch on again because it kind of went by really, really fast is a very famous objection that's called the Euthyphra Dilemma. All right, this is getting back to Plato. I'm going to enunciate that very clear, not Play-Doh, Plato. And he proposed, lots of times the way he wrote is he wrote in dialogues where he would have like two people talking back and forth to each other in order to illustrate something, some point. In this particular one, he had Socrates talking to Euthyphra, all right? And the basic, I'm not going to give you all the way he actually wrote it because it's all fancy old language that you wouldn't understand, but here's what it boils down to. The discussion going back and forth between these two characters, Does God command something because it is good? All right? If that's the case, then God is not sovereign. What we mean by that is if there's a source, if whatever is good is something that even God has to appeal to that's outside of himself, then that means God is not the most sovereign, powerful, be-all and end-all of the universe. There's a source of morality that even he is subject to. All right? So that was the first horn of the dilemma that Plato suggested, is that if God commands something because it's good, that means that there must be some source of goodness outside of God that even God is appealing to. The second one is something good because God commands it. Does the act of him commanding something make it good? Well, if that's the case, then God appears arbitrary, because if God had commanded something different, then something different would have been. If he commanded someone to commit murder, then murder would be good. And that doesn't seem right to us either. And so a lot of people look at this, well, then, this is a dilemma, because either God can't be the most powerful and the most important entity in the universe because he's appealing to some moral standard above himself, or God is arbitrary, and everything we think of as morality is simply arbitrary. When you see dilemmas like this come up, and people, anytime, this is a warning bell, just a tactical warning bell, when someone tries to force you into two alternatives, odds are there's a third, all right, and they're just not presenting it to you, and that's the case here. Remember how we defined morality, and where do we say morality comes from? The source of moral values is what?
God.
God's what? What about God?
His character.
His character. Is his character outside of him or inside of him? Inside of him, exactly. So when that first horn of the dilemma says that if God orders something because it's good, he must be appealing to something outside of himself, is not true. All right? God orders something because he is good. He's looking inside himself for that source of what is moral. All right? And as a result, he's ordering what is in conjunction with his character. So there's nothing outside of him that's the ultimate source of morality that he's appealing to. He's appealing to himself, basically. So he is still sovereign. All right. This meme, I don't know how much, if you can read it on the screen or not, is something I actually just confronted this week. This is brand new. You're going to see things like this all the time, especially on the internet. All right? And this is illustrating a point that came up in that debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. And this is, oh my gosh, it's so common in the world today, it makes me want to pull my hair out. All right? People misrepresenting what this argument says. All right? Here's what the meme says. It says, Sweden is 80% atheist. Imagine an entire country without morals. Oh, wait, they have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. Guess religion isn't all that important after all. All right? First of all, I'm leaving aside for the moment the factual inaccuracies. Okay, Sweden is not 80% atheist. All right, they do not have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. But let's forget that for a second. What fundamentally this meme is trying to suggest is that Christians, or theists, but really Christians, are arguing that you have to believe in God in order to be good. Is that what the moral argument said? No, that's not what the moral argument said. It says in order for there to be something called good in the first place, you have to have a source for that, and that has to be God. It has to be a person in order for there to be objective moral duties, for example. But it doesn't say that you have to believe in God in order to do something good. In that cute little William Lane Craig cartoon we just saw at the beginning here, we had an atheist who rescued a cat from a tree. Congratulations, there is proof that you don't need to believe in God to do good deeds. All right? You do in order to tithe, as we found out, but that's different. So it's a misrepresentation, and this happens all the time. You will probably far more often than you see someone who actually understands the moral argument, you will see someone misrepresenting it. You saw Christopher Hitchens do the exact same thing. He was, unfortunately, as he passed away, very intelligent man, one of the better atheistic debaters out there, and even he misrepresented what the argument was. Even his response to it was just this. Well, I don't have to believe in God to do good deeds. Of course you don't. And of course, that's also consistent with Christianity. Look what it says in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. It says, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. Look, we're all created in the image of God, right? Now, it's a fallen image because we're a fallen humanity. But if we're created in the image of God, and God has his perfect character, that means part of that character has been imputed to us. It's not perfect, but it means that we're going to somewhat be able to tap into this moral law, all right? And we're all going to have a sense of it, which is why you see certain rules that pop up in all cultures, because we all have that moral sense in us, all right? Which also means that you don't have to believe in God to do good deeds. You can have a fundamental understanding of what that moral law is. That's not the question. The question is, can you intellectually provide a basis for it? And if you deny the existence of God, you can't explain it. You can't explain why this objective moral law exists. All right, the remainder of the class, last 25 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the problem of evil. Now, everything that we talked about so far is great. It gives you another argument for the existence of God. It also provides one of the number one explanations for the problem of evil and suffering. We've got another short video. I think this one's just about 8 minutes or so, 8 or 9 minutes, from Dr. Ravi Zacharias. I shouldn't say doctor. There's a big hubbub came up last year because his doctoral degrees were honorary degrees that were bestowed upon him by universities for all the work he's done, but he actually does not have a formal doctorate degree. So we'll just say Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias. There's 2 different videos here where he's explaining the problem of evil and suffering. All right, so I'm going to kind of get his explanation for what the answer is, and then we'll spend the rest of the class diving a little bit deeper into it. All right. Congratulations, you have made it through the last video of the class. Woo-hoo! All right, now the bad news. The rest of the class, the last 15 minutes, is just listen to me talk. All right. Thanks. You think I didn't hear that? All right. So first of all, let's define what the problem of evil is. And remember David Hume, we talked about him before as an atheistic philosopher. Here's how he captured it. He said, referring to God, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? In other words, if God is willing to prevent evil, but he's not able to do it, he doesn't have sufficient power to do it, then he's not all-powerful. Whereas if God does have the power to prevent evil, but he just doesn't want to, then he's evil. He's malevolent. If he is both able to prevent evil and willing to prevent evil, then why do we see evil in the first place? That's the problem. And you can certainly see why this is the number one reason by far that causes people to leave the Christian faith, or the number one objection that is raised to the Christian faith. Because we obviously do preach a God who is all-powerful and who is all-loving. So, I don't know if you caught this or not. One thing I love about Ravi Zacharias, I've said before that my personal preference, I love William Lane Craig, but I also love Ravi Zacharias. These are probably 2 of my favorites. Ravi Zacharias, I think, addresses the problem of evil better than anybody else, and suffering and pain. And largely that's because of his background. He actually came from a bed of suicide himself. He had gotten to that point in his life where he attempted suicide. And it was after he was in the hospital, being taken to the hospital after his suicide attempt, that somebody brought him a Bible. And he first started hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he certainly comes from a position where he has personally been through a lot of pain and suffering. And so for that reason, I think that has brought a very unique perspective from him, and he is really, really talented at addressing this issue. And one of the number one reasons builds on what we talked about with the moral argument, and that's the hidden assumption. He gave you a quote from C.S. Lewis that you always got to look for the hidden assumptions. The question is, how can a good God allow so much evil in the world? Well, there's a hidden assumption to this question, that there is such a thing as evil. Well, in order to be evil, what is evil? In order for there to be such a thing as evil, there has to be such a thing as good. Because otherwise you don't know what's evil unless you have a standard to compare it to. Remember that the white to black bar we shot from my editing software? All right, you've got to know what the white standard is in order to know how far you're devolving from it, right? In order to what makes something evil. So when you say there's evil in the world, you're assuming there's a standard of goodness to define what that is. But what did we just learn was necessary in order for there to be such a thing as good? God, I tell you, you're getting tired. It's the 6th week. We're at the end of the class. You've now reached the point that every class reaches this point where you're mouthing the answers, but there's no sound actually coming out. All right, my voice, for once, is actually holding up pretty well. The rest of you are the ones losing them. All right? Yeah, God. You're assuming, the question even assumes God exists in the question. They don't realize it, but they are assuming the existence of God. All right? What that means is we have to approach this question from a starting point that God exists, all right? Because it's necessary for the question to even make sense in the first place. Now, something that wasn't touched on in the video so much that I want to make sure we clarify is most philosophers will identify 2 different types of evil, all right? First is what's called natural evil. I kind of object to that term personally. I'll explain why in a minute, but this is usually what you see. You'll see natural evil, things like tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, natural events. And there's also what's called moral evil. Moral evil are evil acts that are taken by personal agents, such as murder, rape, robbery. Now, C.S. Lewis writes a book on this subject, and I love the title of his book. It's called The Problem of Pain. I much personally prefer that term to the term evil, at least especially when applied to natural actions. And the reason for that is, remember what we're talking about with evil. Evil is a moral descriptor. It's a moral term. Can a tornado be evil? Is a tornado a moral agent? It's not. It's a hurricane is not a person. A hurricane is no different, like we talked about a cat. When a cat kills a mouse, do we say that a cat did something morally wrong? No, we don't. When a tornado destroys a house, do we say that a tornado did something morally wrong? No, we don't. And so that's why I don't personally favor the term evil when we're talking about natural disasters, so to speak. I like pain, That's a pretty good term, I guess, and I'm open to some other things too. But I just want to make sure we're clear that there is a fundamental difference between these 2 types of things. One is something that's committed by a moral agent, by a person, and the other is not. All right? Now, because of that distinction, we do need to take a kind of a multifaceted approach when we're examining this question. One explanation might not necessarily explain to all types of suffering that's out there. So let's talk first about something called the free will theodicy, and I'm going to start out this explanation with a question. Who likes the idea of being a pre-programmed robot? Anyone? Thankfully, all the times I've asked this question, to date I haven't had anybody raise their hand and say, I will, all right? Because generally speaking, we don't, all right? We want to be free to choose what we do in our lives, all right? And I think we can see that having freedom of the will in and of itself is a good thing. Well, one of the things Ravi Zacharias mentioned is in order for there to be such a thing as love, in order for us to engage in loving actions, we have to have free will. Because if you force someone to do something, can you really say that they're doing it out of love? No. In order to be loving, they have to choose to do it. That's part of the nature of what love is. All right? So free will in and of itself is something that is good. All right? Well, what does it mean to be free? To be truly free? If you can only choose one action, are you truly free? Is it really a choice? No. In order to be free, you have to have multiple avenues open to you, and you have to have the freedom to choose which action you want to take. And that means that sometimes those actions are going to be good, and sometimes they're going to be bad. And you have to have the freedom to choose between the 2 of them. So if you want a world where we can engage in loving actions, you also, by definition, have to have a world where we can engage in evil actions. All right? They come hand in hand. You can't have both. So what the free will theodicy says is that God has created a world where we have freedom. That's a good thing. But as a result, evil actions are going to necessarily result from that. We have to expect that. Now, again, part of the reason I want to make sure we have the distinction between the 2 different types at the very beginning is think about this for a second. This is probably the most popular, a theodicy is a fancy word for an explanation, a possible explanation for evil, or for the evil actions and the suffering in the world. This can certainly explain personal or moral evil, but not what I like to call the natural pains. Although theologically it possibly could. In other words, we can say that we live in a fallen world because of the free choice of Adam and Eve. And that fallen world is what's led to things like the tornadoes and the hurricanes and things like that. You're not going to get too much leeway with atheists with that explanation, however, who don't believe in Adam and Eve in the fallen world. And so this free will theodicy certainly can explain why people commit moral acts. But most non-believers, non-Christians, are not going to think, they're going to respond to this, but even if they acknowledge all that, they're going to say, okay, but this doesn't explain why God allows people to be killed by hurricanes, by tornadoes. And I got to be honest, it's usually, not always, but usually that's where this question comes up, because there'll be some major hurricane in some, Caribbean nation that will wipe out, huge portions of the population. It does arise in personal evil acts. Obviously, it arises every time we see a mass shooting, all right? But these natural disasters can be truly devastating, and so that's largely where this comes up. So we have to have an explanation for that as well, a possible explanation for why God might allow this. And that's where one theodicy that I like to mention is called the soul-making theodicy. There's another thing, and Ravi Zacharias touched on both of these. I don't know if you caught it or not. And let me ask you a question. If a mother needs to grab a toddler's hand before they touch a hot burner, they're about to touch it, they might need to grab it very quickly and move it out of the way quickly before they do that. Well, is that going to cause some level of pain to that toddler's arm? Yes, most likely it is, right? Does that mean that that mother committed an evil act? No, exactly. So there are certain things. Now, let me flip side that. Let's pretend that the mother didn't grab that toddler's hand in time, and that toddler touched that hot burner and burned their hand. Do you think that toddler is going to touch another hot burner again? No. Not likely, all right? They learn an important lesson through that, all right? So you can see it both ways. Now that's a kind of a simple example, but we as adults can look back on more complex times of pain and suffering we've gone through, chapters in our lives when things have not been going according to how we might like them to be. And let me ask you this question. Have any of you ever come out of a season in your life where things have not gone well and learned something as a result?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we all reach a point in our life where we can say, yeah, there have been lessons we have learned through pain, all right? This all hints at what's called the soul-making theodicy. There are certain things that God does to shape our character, or I should say more, God allows, because I don't think it's necessary to propose that God is the immediate agent of these things. He doesn't have to be. But he does certainly allow them to happen. I mean, he doesn't stop the tornado from tearing up the house and sending it, lifting it up in Kansas and sending it to the world of Oz, right? Although he did obviously bring a good about deed from that because he killed the Wicked Witch of the East. No, I'm kidding, okay. So just seeing who's still paying attention. Also, things like certain qualities like courage, integrity, patience, things like this that we talked about character at the beginning of class, certain character traits that in order to develop them, they require that we face some level of adversity, don't they? So it is plausible, at least, that God can allow certain pains to enter into our lives and allows them to happen in order to shape our character, in order to develop us into better people, all right? That explanation, I think, can suffice for the natural evils. That is a possibility, especially when you keep an eternal perspective. Understand a lot of times this objection arises because people are assuming that when someone, say, passes away as a result of tragedy, that's the end. That's the last chapter of the story. And we don't believe that to be true. And so that's getting into something we don't really have time for because we only got like 3 minutes left here. But another thing you need to keep in mind when you're talking about the problem of pain and suffering in the world is we as Christians have an eternal perspective. That whatever happens at the end of that life, no matter how tragic that life ends, that's not the end. That's not the final chapter. As a matter of fact, really, if you're talking in relation to eternity, that's one of the very earlier chapters in all of our books. Personally, I don't favor the soul. I do not favor the soul making as an explanation for acts of moral evil. It can suffice for the natural pains. In other words, personal actions. I don't think that. I have a problem personally with saying that, well, God allows someone to commit a rape so that a greater good can result from that, so that we can learn some lesson through the rape. Because in my way of thinking, that makes God at least a secondary agent of that evil act, and that's unbecoming of a good God. All right. So this is why I say we have to take a multifaceted approach. The free will theodicy certainly can explain why that rape occurred. All right. But I caution people against trying to say that, well, maybe God allowed that to happen in order that some other good could result from it, some character building or something like that. Can you imagine if you were talking to somebody who's been through something like that and that's the explanation you gave to them? I think they would hit you, and I think you deserve it. Okay? And so this is why we have to kind of have a full arsenal of this kind of thing and explain to understand the context that the question is being presented to us in. So put it all together. Last two slides of the class. All right, first of all, just from what we talked about tonight, what have we learned? We have learned that we cannot even ask the question about the problem of evil and suffering without first assuming that God exists. That's what the moral argument showed us, right? The existence of evil actually proves the existence of God. It doesn't disprove it, because you can't even ask the question without assuming God exists in the first place. Therefore, this is a mystery at best, for which we know there's a solution even if we don't see it. In other words, we have to assume God's in the picture by the nature of the question. And so even if we don't necessarily know why a certain act occurred, it doesn't cause us to question God. And this can be very powerful when you're going through times of suffering yourself. All right? You understand that in order to even raise this question, God has to be in the picture. Maybe I don't know why this is happening. Maybe I don't understand the purpose. But I can't use it to reject God, because that just causes me all the more problems, even more problems. Moral evil occurs or could occur because God's given us free will. But free will in itself is a good thing that we don't want to give up. All right? And lastly, God may allow natural pains, your tornadoes, your hurricanes, things like that, in order to build our character or for other greater goods. Keep in mind, he's infinite, we're finite. God can see things that we can't. All right? So looking back on the whole class, all right, it's been 6 weeks. It's been a lot. And sometimes I know, especially when it's spread out week by week by week, it's hard to kind of put all the pieces together. So I'd like to take one last slide at the very end. Let's put it all together and think through everything we've seen over the course of the past 6 weeks. We learned that the Christian God exists. All right, and we learned that through multiple arguments. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, remember that's the design argument, and tonight, the moral argument. Plenty of reasons to believe that God does in fact exist. And if you believe that God doesn't exist, you've got a lot of explaining to do, because you've got to refute all of these evidences. All right? We have also learned that we have accurate reproductions of what the original scriptures said, especially the New Testament. All right? That the copies we have today, what we have written today, are in fact accurate copies of what was originally written. We learned that the New Testament provides us with reliable history. We learned that these are trustworthy documents, trustworthy historical documents, just like any other historical document. We can look at them for reliable evidence of what actually happened. Now, through those documents, now that we know that they're reliable, we look at them and see what they said, and they're accurately reporting what Jesus said, and we find out that what did Jesus say? He claimed to be God. So he did, in fact, make those claims about himself. We also found out that those claims were confirmed by the miracles that he performed and by the miracle of his resurrection. In regard to the resurrection, we looked at minimal facts approach, and we learned that that is remarkably well attested historically. Therefore, put all those pieces of the puzzle together, and where does it lead you? And what are you going to do with the evidence? Putting it all together, the case for Christ is pretty darn solid. That's my proposal. All right? That's it. I want to thank everybody for coming. Those of you that stuck through it to the end, congratulations. You made it. I really appreciate it. It's much more fun to be up here with people that I'm actually talking to than when nobody shows up. So, all right, go home, have fun, and do something with it. All right, and don't forget, pocket-sized apologetics is a really good builder to build on the stuff that we've learned today. It'll be a refresher for some of it. It'll be new information. Friday, September 15th is when that premieres. 2 minutes a week. I think we can all spare 2 minutes a week, right? And share it with other people. All right? God bless. Have a great night. Hey, thanks for watching. Trinity Lutheran Church can be found at 1100 Philadelphia Road in Joppa, Maryland. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you like this video, go ahead and click the like button. That's a thumbs up button right here on the YouTube page. And you could also be a big help to us if you go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, and God bless.